Hmm. My brother didn't just exclude me from his wedding rehearsal dinner. He looked me in the eye and said, "You're too much of a distraction, and honestly, Claire, we just don't want the energy you bring around Stephanie's family." Those were his exact words. My own brother, the one I used to share a bedroom wall with, the one I drove to the emergency room at 2 in the morning when he broke his wrist playing basketball in college. That same person stood in my parents' living room, with my mother nodding slowly behind him, and told me I was too much of a distraction. I didn't cry until I got to my car. Let me give you some context, because this didn't come from nowhere. Or maybe it did, and that's the part that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it too hard. My brother and I grew up pretty close. There's only 3 years between us, and for most of our childhood, that meant everything. We were each other's backup, each other's witness to the chaos that was our household. Our parents weren't cruel, but they were the kind of people who moved through life making small, quiet choices that added up to something ugly over time. My brother was the one who got the benefit of every doubt. I was the one who had to explain herself. I used to tell myself it was a boy-girl thing, just the way their generation thought. But as I got older, I realized it was more specific than that. It wasn't about gender. It was about the fact that my brother had decided, at some point in his late teens, to become the version of himself that our parents wanted. And I had not. I had opinions. I spoke up at the dinner table. I chose a career they didn't quite understand. I work in UX design, which my mother still describes to her friends as something with computers. I moved to a different city. I dated people they weren't sure about. None of this was dramatic. None of it was scandalous. I was just a person who had her own life. And somewhere along the way, that became a problem. When my brother got engaged to Stephanie, I was genuinely happy for him. I liked Stephanie. She was warm, she laughed easily, and the first time we met, she spent 20 minutes asking me about my work because she was actually curious. I thought, okay, maybe this is the thing that shifts the dynamic. Maybe this is when our family starts to grow up a little. I offered to help with whatever they needed. I told my brother I was there for all of it, the planning, the logistics, the emotional support when vendor stress inevitably took over. He said, "We'll keep you posted." That was the last real conversation we had about the wedding for almost 4 months. Then my mother called. She didn't call to have a conversation. She called to deliver a message, which is something she has always done. Positioned herself as a neutral relay between people who, in her version of events, are simply misunderstanding each other. She told me that my brother and Stephanie had decided to keep the wedding party very small, just close friends they'd known for years, and that they hoped I would understand. I asked her if I was still invited to the wedding itself. She paused for just a second too long before saying, "Of course, yes, your family." That pause told me everything. 2 weeks later, I got an email, not a phone call, not even a text, an email informing me that due to revenue capacity constraints, the rehearsal dinner would be limited to immediate family and the wedding party. I was not in the wedding party. My name was not on the list. I replied asking if there was a mistake, and my brother called me that evening, which is when he said what he said about the distraction and the energy. I asked him what I had done. I genuinely wanted to know. He said it wasn't about anything I'd done. It was just about what was best for the start of his marriage. I asked him if Stephanie felt this way too. And he said, "We're aligned on this." Which is the kind of non-answer that means he didn't want to implicate her, but also wasn't willing to take full ownership. I got off the phone and I sat in my apartment for a long time. I thought about calling my father, but I already knew what he would say, which was something careful and balanced that ultimately meant nothing and changed nothing. And sure enough, when I did call him the next day, he said the exact phrase I had been predicting in my head. Sometimes you just have to let people have their day. Their day. My exclusion was something I was supposed to absorb quietly so that someone else could have their day. My boyfriend Marcus had been listening to all of this from the other room, and that night he sat down next to me on the couch, turned off the TV and said, "You know what we should do? We should go somewhere." I told him the rehearsal dinner was in 11 days. He said, I know. Let's be somewhere else entirely. Marcus is the kind of person who fixes things by moving towards something instead of away from something. He doesn't say, forget about them. He says, let's build something better right now. I have spent most of my adult life looking for someone who operates that way. And somehow, I found him at a work conference where we both reached for the last cup of bad coffee at the same time. That's a story for another day. We started looking at flights that night. I had some PTO saved up, and Marcus is a freelance architect, which means his schedule has flexibility that most people would envy. We found a trip to Portugal, Lisbon, and the Algarve coast, and the dates lined up almost perfectly. We would leave 2 days before the rehearsal dinner and come back 5 days after. The whole thing felt almost too clean. I did not tell my family I was leaving. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to the story. I didn't announce it, I didn't post about it, I didn't send a pointed message. I simply made my own plans, for my own life, during a stretch of time when I had been quietly made to feel like I didn't belong in theirs. Marcus and I packed our bags, got a car to the airport at 4 a.m, and left. Lisbon was everything I didn't know I needed. We stayed in a small apartment in Alfama, the old neighborhood that climbs at the hillside like it was stacked there by hand over centuries. The streets were narrow and the tiles were blue, and every evening the fado music came drifting out from somewhere nearby, this achingly beautiful sound that I can only describe as music that already knows how the story ends. I bought pastéis de nata from the bakery 2 doors down every single morning. Marcus sketched constantly. He carries a small notebook, and whenever something catches his eye, architecturally, he just stops and draws it, which used to make me impatient, and now I find it one of my favorite things about him. On the day of the rehearsal dinner, we were on a train to the Algarve. I had my headphones in, and the window open a crack, and the landscape was rolling past in the golden late afternoon light, and I thought, in a way that surprised me with its quietness, I am okay. I am genuinely okay. My phone had been on, but I hadn't been checking it obsessively. I got a few texts from my mother asking if I was coming to some of the events, which told me she either hadn't noticed I was gone or was pretending not to. I didn't respond right away. I was eating a sandwich on a train in Portugal, and that felt like enough of a response to the universe. We got to the coast, and the water was this impossible shade of blue-green, the kind that doesn't look real in photographs, and then looks even less real in person. We swam in the afternoon and had dinner outside at a restaurant where the owner brought us a complimentary glass of wine and sat with us for a few minutes to ask where we were from. I told him the whole story. I'm not sure why. Maybe because he was a stranger and the wine was good. And he laughed and said something like, "Good, you are here. That is the right choice." I thought about that a lot over the next few days. The wedding was on a Saturday. Marcus and I were hiking along the coastal cliffs that morning, and I had exactly 3 bars of signal, and I made a conscious choice not to look at my phone until we were back at the hotel. We hiked for 4 hours. We ate lunch at a little place perched above the water. We held hands on the walk back, and I told Marcus I was grateful he'd suggested this, and he said, "I know you. Sometimes you just need to be moving." When I finally checked my phone that afternoon, there were 14 unread messages. The first few were from my mother, and their tone shifted in a way that told a story without telling me the story. The first ones were cheerful and logistics-focused. "Call me when you get a chance. Just wanted to check in." Then, around midday, they became something else. "Where are you? Have you talked to your father? Can you please call me?" Then there was a message from my aunt, who I'm close to and who has always had the clearest view of our family dynamics out of anyone. Her message said, "Honey, I don't know where you are, but I hope you're somewhere good. Things got complicated here. Call me when you can." I called her. She told me in that careful, measured way she has, the way that means she's been thinking about how to explain something for a while, that the wedding had not gone the way anyone planned. Stephanie's family had shown up in full force, and that was when certain things became apparent that apparently had not been apparent before. Stephanie's mother, it turned out, had been trying to reach my brother for several weeks about some financial concerns she'd developed regarding the business venture he'd been quietly involved in with Stephanie's cousin, a real estate investment group, the kind that had been taking money from family members based on documentation that, once a financial advisor finally looked at it properly, didn't hold up the way it was supposed to. My brother hadn't started this. He'd been brought into it by Stephanie's cousin, who had a very polished pitch and apparently a very thin paper trail. But my brother had known something was off for a few months and he hadn't said anything, and Stephanie's mother had found that out, and she had chosen the rehearsal dinner the night before the wedding to raise the issue in a way that left no room for quiet resolution. The wedding still happened, but the reception was, according to my aunt, extraordinarily tense. Stephanie's father didn't speak to my brother all night. There was a moment during the toasts where Stephanie's cousin simply wasn't there anymore. He had left and everyone noticed. By the end of the evening, what was supposed to be the happiest night of my brother's life had become the beginning of a very long and complicated conversation about trust and money and who knew what and when. And my mother had been trying to reach me all day because, apparently, in the middle of all of it, my brother had said he wished I was there. I sat with that for a while. I want to be honest about what I felt, because I think the honest answer is more complicated than just satisfaction. Though I'd be lying if I said there wasn't some of that. There was. There was a moment where I thought very clearly he called me a distraction. He said I brought bad energy, and now his wedding has more drama in it than anything I could have possibly caused. But underneath that was something sadder. Because the truth is, if I had been there, I probably would have tried to help. Not because I deserved to be treated the way I'd been treated, but because that's who I am. I'm the person who shows up. I'm the person who sits in the car outside the emergency room waiting. My brother knew that about me. And part of what hurt, more than the exclusion itself, was the sense that he'd taken that quality in me for granted, and then punished me for the parts of myself that went along with it. Marcus was sitting on the balcony when I came outside and told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about him. When I finished, he said, "What do you need right now?" I said. "I think I just need to sit here for a while." So we sat. The sun was going down over the water, and the sky was doing something extraordinary with the light. That particular evening palette you only get on coastlines. And I thought about my brother in a rented venue somewhere, having a very different kind of night than either of us had planned. I called my mother back the next morning. She was upset in the way that she gets when she's been trying to manage something and it's escaped her management. She asked me why I hadn't told anyone I was leaving. I told her that I hadn't been given much reason to think my presence was wanted. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Your brother feels terrible." I told her that I hoped he and Stephanie would be okay, and that I hoped they'd figure out the situation with the investment, and that I was in Portugal and I'd be home in a few days and we could talk then. She said, "Portugal?" She hadn't known. Nobody had known. And somehow, in that moment, that mattered to me in a way I hadn't expected. Not as a point scored, but as a reminder that I had my own life, a full and real and beautiful life. And it had continued exactly as it was supposed to while everyone else was caught up in a storm I'd had the wisdom to step out of. My brother called me 2 days later. I was at a small bookshop in Lisbon buying a book about the history of Portuguese azulejo tiles, which Marcus had gently made fun of me for, and I stepped outside to take the call. He apologized. Not a full, comprehensive, everything on the table apology. I want to be honest about that, because I think sometimes we tell these stories and round the edges into something cleaner than real life. It was a partial apology. He said he'd handled things badly. He said the way he'd spoken to me on the phone was wrong. He didn't fully excavate the favoritism or the years of small moments that had added up, but he admitted that specific thing, and I could hear in his voice that it was genuine. I told him I appreciated him saying it. I told him I hoped he and Stephanie could work through what had happened. I meant both of those things. Then I went back inside and bought the tile book. Marcus and I flew home on a Tuesday. I was tan and rested, and I had a suitcase full of olive oil, wine, and ceramic things I'd justified to myself as practical souvenirs. At baggage claim, Marcus looked at me and said, "You seem different than when we left." I asked him what he meant. He said, "Lighter." I thought about what the restaurant owner had told me on the coast. "You are here. That is the right choice." I had been here, fully and deliberately here, while everything else sorted itself out without me. Here is what I know now, that I think I only half knew before: the people who decide you are too much, too distracting, too complicated to include in the important moments. They aren't seeing you accurately. They are seeing the version of you that makes them most uncomfortable with their own choices. My brother didn't exclude me because I brought bad energy. He excluded me because I'm the kind of person who would have asked questions, who would have noticed things, who would have been too present to be easily managed. And somewhere in him, maybe not consciously, he knew that the investment situation is still being sorted out. My brother and Stephanie are still together, which I'm glad about, and they're working through it the way you work through something that cracks the foundation, carefully, painfully, with a lot of conversations that probably don't end well. My relationship with my brother is in a kind of holding pattern right now. Not hostile, not warm, honest, maybe, in a way it hasn't been in years. My mother still describes my job as something with computers. Some things stay the same, but I have my tiles and my olive oil and the memory of a coastline at sunset with someone who looked at me in the middle of all of it and asked me what I needed. And I have this. The knowledge that when someone tells you that you don't belong in their story, you are absolutely allowed to go live in your own. That's not giving up. That's not running away. That is the most powerful thing you can do. Decide that your peace is not negotiable, that your joy is not contingent on someone else's permission, and that the life happening outside the room you've been excluded from is still, completely and entirely, yours. I booked another trip last week. Marcus and I are going to Japan in the spring. He already has a new sketchbook. If you grew up in a family where you were always the one who had to explain yourself, where you watched someone else get the benefit of every doubt while you got the burden of every expectation, I see you. You are not too much. You are not a distraction. You are a person who deserves to be in every room you walk into. And when someone tries to close a door on you, the bravest thing in the world is turning around and opening a window that faces something more beautiful than they could have offered you anyway. Don't wait for them to realize your worth. Go book the flight.